who only knew Professor Bailey as an undergraduate. So in my senior year, I was an oceanography major. I sat in on a class of his, and during that class, he said, people are drawn to anthropology because they feel marginal in their own culture and they're looking for a culture to fit in. And given that I was a 19-year-old kid at the time, I thought, yes. And during the hippie years, I thought, yes, that's me. So he did have a profound impact on my life. Without him and taking just one class from him, we wouldn't have this. I mention this maybe because I like to talk about myself, but also just I'm confused about what to refer to him, because it was not imaginable to me ever to call my professor as an undergraduate Freddie. Pardon me if I just stay a little bit more formal than that in my own way of addressing him. Okay, before we begin the conversation, I need to take a moment to put in a word of thanks for SASI, the Society of Anthropological Sciences, and Vilnius University, who support and sponsor our series conversation. This is the second one. Thomas Beluski is the man behind the Zoom and is doing the heavy lifting, as Elisa Sobo said, and he's a student at the Institute of Asian and Transcultural Studies, where I'm presently working here. The University of Vilnius and SASI are also putting together Anthropology Conference. And can you put up that slide quickly about the conference, Thomas, if we have it?
Is the slide seeable?
Mm-hmm.
I'm now sharing my screen.
So this will be January 2022. The title was conceived by Gitika D, who's on our committee, the SASI, we call ourselves SASI East or SASI East Asia. Old disciplinary trajectories, theories, methods, and practices in anthropology, and you can see it for yourself, but there's a call for papers if you're interested, and if we want to have a panel on Professor Bailey, easily managed there. Vilnius is a lovely city. It's about 600,000 people, easy to walk around. I think a long time ago, EJ visited me here with their newborn at the time, now going to college, I think, next year. Okay, so let me see, what else do I need to say here? Elisa is going to present a short overview of our Festschrift for Professor Bailey. And can you do that now? She started sharing the screen. Can you all see it?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, late at night, wherever you are. This is so wonderful to see all these familiar faces and all these people who I've been emailing to and never saw your faces. It's wonderful to meet you, and it's just great to be in the same room. So I'm just going to very quickly give you a word about the Festschrift that we're in the process of preparing for Professor Bailey. I, like Victor, never felt comfortable calling my teachers by their first name. It's just, I don't know. We can psychoanalyze me about that later, but okay, so let's see if I can get the slides to move forward. Okay, so Festschrift, a volume of writings by the colleagues, former students, etc., of a noted scholar published in their honor. Oftentimes this is done on like a retirement or some kind of anniversary. We missed the boat, but we're catching up. We've got a lovely, lovely volume in preparation for Manchester University Press. I hope I don't need to explain why we chose that press, and we're very happy that the book will, again, fingers crossed, be coming out with them. I want to give a quick shout out to San Diego State University, University of California at San Diego, and Vilnius University for helping us with this effort, for providing a little funding for indexing and so forth. So, yeah. I have to smile here, because as I look at the faces, I think, oh yeah, of course, that's so-and-so, that's so-and-so, that's so-and-so, but we all look so different. And so now maybe seeing my picture here will help you place me in your memory as to who I was. But I love that picture of Professor Bailey. That's the Professor Bailey that I remember. And there is very much a sense of wanting to please our teacher. And hopefully in this volume, we will have produced something that he would be happy with. As you can see, there are many, many, many chapters. When we put out the call, many people just came forward quickly. I'm going to give you a minute to have a glance at this table of contents. Quicker for me to show you than to read out all the titles. And where we're at right now, and I can send this to anybody who wants it, who hasn't seen it. Where we're at right now is we did the recruitment last winter pre-COVID, and I want to give a big thanks to Paula Levin for helping us with that, for searching out and finding people who we didn't know, finding those connections, tracking those links, and everybody who helped with that web of connections to bring people in. Sadly, of course, Professor Bailey passed away in July, and I wanted to bring to attention a couple of the many memorial essays that have been written. We had the first one that our group had out was in Anthropology News, the In Memoriam by Stan Barrett. We have in our group, again, 2 contributions to Indian sociology obituaries. I'm going to put these links in the chat for y'all if you want to look at them later. And then more recently, one that took a little longer was for the American Anthropologist. I also want to draw people's attention to, you may, of course, many people in this room already know about the archives at SOAS, the FGB papers. You can see from the link there. And this illustration was just drawn right from the front page of that. It's got all kinds of stuff in there that our professor had donated for the good of the discipline into there. Many pictures and documents and so forth. And it's interesting how just looking at the shape of the writing brings back so many memories, comments in the margins of papers. I'm sure many of you can relate to that kind of thing. So, okay, so as far as timeline, we did the recruitment, we got papers in, we're nearly ready to submit within a week, perhaps, within a week or 2 weeks, get everything off there to the press. While all that's happening, we're going to be arranging to have tributes, photos, and so forth put up on a Festschrift website that UCSD is going to post for us. All of this is a little bit mishmash because of pandemic. We were going to have a panel somewhat like this for the 50th anniversary of the UCSD department, which was last May. Hopefully we're going to be able to pull something off if and when that comes together, and publication in early 2022, perhaps. So I want to just close off with this photo here. Obviously, everybody can see Professor Bailey in the middle. It was significant for me to come across this photo because I realized, oh my gosh, 3 of my mentors are right here. Up here, I don't know if you guys, when we share, if you can see my pointer, but does anybody know who's that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can see down here. Is and then over here, this one really was, I had to laugh because I had no idea who this person was. And then I read, oh my gosh, yeah, that's Ronnie Frankenberg. So that's all I want to say about the Festschrift. We're moving, we're driving, we're on the road, we're nearly there. We just got to keep chugging along, and it's going to be hopefully something that our professor will be very proud of, happy to have. And I want to just give a shout out again, as Victor already did, to Tomas for the technical support, to Victor for organizing this, to the sponsors of this session, Vilnius University and SASE, and then of course to our distinguished speakers, which means I now shuffle off stage left and we get to the meat of the matter.
That's it. Okay. Thanks a lot, EJ. So we're going to start. We'll have 2 rounds of discussion. The first round will be on Professor Bailey's influence on the work and thoughts of our discussants. And so it's more informal, and each speaker will have between 10 and 15 minutes each. And then we're going to go directly to the second round. The second round will be on an appraisal of his work and how it fits into contemporary and its relevance in contemporary anthropology and political science. Okay, so we're gonna, the round will start with Professor Gavin Smith, and then Gitika D, and then Felix Girke. So, Gavin?
Well, thanks very much, Victor. Thank you for organizing this, Alyssa, Victor, and all of you. As Victor knows, it came as a bit of a surprise when you asked me to write something about Freddie. And I just will begin by referring to what you both said, just to point out that I too was a little surprised about calling Freddie by his first name. But I can tell you, when you went to the University of Sussex a few years after Freddie had set the department up, everybody called everybody by their first names. And Freddie was extremely accessible as Freddie. And the person who was much less sort of accessible in that manner was David Pocock, who was a terrifying figure in my estimate. But and as you probably know, and as I think I mentioned in the chapter, the irony of it was that Freddie and Pocock had a falling out, or certainly there'd been a lot of aggro between the two of them over the contribution. I'm sure Gitika knows about this. Anyway, it was kind of interesting that Freddie managed to get David Pocock into the department. So let me just talk a little bit about my experience with Freddie, and I've titled this "The Freddie I Knew." The first thing I want to say is, and I'm going to try and say this without being a little weepy, he was the best teacher I ever had. I'm sorry. He was incredibly clear about what interested him, and so what you could get from him. He was not at all bookish, which for somebody like me who was entering the discipline late in life and who really was not an anthropologist, was incredibly encouraging. Freddie was not somebody who threw books at you and told you had to read them. He wasn't going to bash you over the head with books and stuff like that. Now, for me, that was an incredible way of being accessible to a graduate program. I had been in the working world for 10 years before I went back to graduate school, and it was a terrifying experience. I do think, though, I have to say that after I left the field, perhaps I was not quite as well read as I should have been, but that's another story. He was interested in what his kind of anthropology could do to help his students with their own interests. Freddie could take a muddled set of thoughts, yet ones you really wanted to get over yourself, and he could sharpen up and give them back to you as though they were your own. I've never really had that experience since, and I've always tried to emulate Freddie on that, but he's a hard act to follow. So in short, as Stan Barrett said to me, he really lived his anthropology, and that rubbed off on us. What I want to do now is just say why I chose to work with Bailey. And I just want to do this by just reminding you of the social and political scene in the 1970s, which was when I arrived at Sussex. As you know, in 1968, Eastern Europe and Western Europe were going through huge political upheavals. In 1970, when I arrived at Sussex, 4 students had just been killed at Wayne State. And that gives you some idea of what the kind of political atmosphere was like. And by the time I finished at Sussex, the war in Vietnam had just ended in 1975. So that gives you some sense of what was happening then. And from my point of view, I saw Bailey, I felt that Bailey had a technique for getting at how politics worked, getting underneath the appearance and showing the underlying complexity. For Freddie, the task of anthropology is to explain the world. He wasn't interested in changing it in any big way. As I've said, I was. And once I got to the field in Highland, Peru, that became even more the case. And I'll probably come back to that in a bit. So what his work means to me, or what it meant to me when I went to Sussex, I want to kind of just go through this with you a little bit. For me, there are two striking features. One is he became much more of a micro-anthropologist after his 3 books on India. And second, that after those 3 books in India, he became much more narrowly a political anthropologist and much less what I would call a political economist. I see my own kind of anthropology in the school of what's called political economy. And I think that Freddie definitely moved in the opposite direction from that. Let me just say how I kind of came to see Freddie, or why I went to study with him. First of all, of course, it was to do with the Manchester School. Freddie was a student of Gluckman, as you know. And I suppose the Manchester School is usually associated with a focus on transactionalism. People as social actors, either as games or theater and so on and so forth. But the thing with Gluckman was that the move was not to abandon social structure, but to explore the tension between individual agency and social structure as norms, laws, and so on. Methodologically, there was a focus on conflicts and tools for getting at social forms. I think you can see Bailey pushing this further by proposing that persistent enactments of individual agency have the effect of constituting social norms and rules of conduct. A tool I used a lot in the field was the extended case method, which gradually evolved from Gluckman's famous essay on the opening of a bridge in Southern Africa to much more specific technologies and techniques in the case of people like Michael Burawoy. That was my first way of reading Freddie. My second way may strike you as being a little unusual, but it didn't strike me as unusual at the time. And this was Schutz's social phenomenology. From an entirely different baseline, and one that didn't really touch on Freddie himself when I knew him, I saw Stratagems and Spoils through the lens of Alfred Schutz's social phenomenology. His on phenomenology and social relations came out in 1970, which was just the year before I turned up at Sussex. For me, getting interested in anthropology and putting it as an angle on Freddie's work was quite important. For Schutz, sociologists' supposed interest in scientific observation was a real problem. For him, the social world needed to be the study of the everyday world, of the way the everyday world is constituted. So hold on a second, I'm just gonna. So how people grasp the consciousness of others, their use of ideal types. I think it was particularly interesting the way phenomenology, the way Schutz took Weber's notion of ideal types and put it into the minds of the actors themselves. Everybody goes into a situation with an ideal type. How people create their own comprehensible reality, their life world, out of the pre-existing cultural factors. There was for Schultz the problem of people act in their, but all beyond that, what is made your practice is with your work in the world. these horizons of relevance are, so social knowledge and the conduct results arise from how horizons of relevance as you address the world each day. So I think, how long have I taken, Victor?
Let me see, it's 1858. You've only taken 8, 9, I've got 9 minutes. Can you hear me? Because
Let
the
me just say
connection is a little
one
weak.
more thing then, and then I'll pass it on.
Okay, the last few minutes, I don't know about other people, but
Yeah.
the
Okay,
connection
I'm
was.
just going to say, okay, so you can see Freddie built on the Manchester School, the Manchester School's ideas, especially the extended case method. As you can see, I began to interpret his work through the lens of Schutz's phenomenology. Mm-hmm. It seemed the perfect match, though Freddie was moving in almost the opposite direction when I was at Sussex, taking up an interest in rhetoric and discourse. By the time we parted ways, he was using a lot of linguistic anthropology and cognitive anthropology of that particular period. Mm-hmm. I think seen through these lenses, his development of the way normative and pragmatic rules work to produce change is an immensely important way of tackling the structure agency problem raised by so many people like Norbert Elias, Pierre Bourdieu, and so on. As Barth has argued, for Bailey, social structure is a dynamic entity continuously being reshaped by the shifting transactions, alliances, coalitions, competitions, and choices that characterize human behavior, human conduct. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gavin. That was wonderful. Gitika?
Thanks, Victor. Am I audible?
Yep. To me, you are.
Thanks, Victor, Sassy, Vilnius, and I'm feeling absolutely overwhelmed to be here in the company of Professor Bailey's students and his colleagues. And I speak as an outsider, but also as an insider because Professor Bailey worked in India. But I'm an outsider to the way that he was as a teacher. But so it was very good to hear Professor Smith talking about how he felt about him as a teacher. So that's I think that's a knowledge which is very important for me. So as Victor had posed, the round one is about how I got acquainted with Professor Bailey's work and how do I use it in my own work. Now, to begin with, my doctoral work, so what I'm going to talk about here is about my doctoral work, which was on the notion of factions and the violence associated with factions in a particular region of the southern Indian state of Andhra Pradesh. So what I'll do is I shall speak on 3 registers wherein Professor Bailey's work has been significant in my own research. So the 3 registers are a conceptual register, a theoretical register, and a methodological register. Many of the things, of course, are going to overlap with what Professor Smith already spoke about, because some of the things, some of the conceptual innovations that Professor Bailey made are very well known, and we all use it actually in our research. So first, let me give a very brief background about my doctoral work to situate it in relation to Bailey's political ethnographies in the state of Orissa that he conducted in the early 1950s. My primary question was to understand the nature of groups called factions. There are several vernacular terms for it. For instance, in Telugu, there are terms like mutha, there are terms like vargam, there are terms like, for Bailey in Odia, the term is dolo. So these terms, these are vernacular terms to understand the term faction. What I did was to study the nature of the groups called factions in a particular region of the southern Indian state of Andhra Pradesh in a diachronic framework over roughly a 40-year period from the year of the formation of the state of Andhra Pradesh in 1956 to the year 2000. Factions have been a germane concept to understand politics in the Indian countryside, as noted by colonial administrators as well as social anthropologists. As such, factions were seen as part of a traditional social organization. However, the phenomenon of factions and factional conflicts has continued as India evolved into a full-blown parliamentary democracy. Bailey in the early 1950s, in his first set of Orissa ethnographies, had analyzed the changes brought about by the apparatuses of the colonial and the newly independent Indian state in a traditional social organization marked by caste, tribe, religion, which was predominantly Hindu, and the village community. Bailey had outlined factions as specific types of associations within a village community and factionalism as conflicts between factions where leaders of factions who are drawn from the dominant castes. In the case of Orissa, which is Bailey's fieldwork location, most of these castes, the dominant castes, were warrior castes. And these castes, the faction leaders who were drawn from the dominant caste, had brokerage functions for both the dependents from other castes and followers belonging to his own caste. Factionalism, therefore, consisted of what Bailey had termed confrontations, that is, show of strength, and encounters, which are overt conflict. I had, in my own fieldwork setting in Andhra Pradesh, almost 50 years after Bailey had conducted his study in Orissa, found remarkably similar groups engaged in similar conflict situations, displaying the same processual aspects of confrontation and encounter in factional conflicts. This is an important aspect of Bailey's conceptual understanding of politics, something that Professor Smith also mentioned. The dialectic between the moral or the normative aspect of politics and the transactional element. The point to note here is the dialectic. Factions as conflict groups manifest very clearly the transactional element, without which most kind of political practices would be difficult to explain. We will have more to discuss on this aspect later, as this has been one of the important points of disagreement between those who try to make sense of political engagement primarily through ideology and party organization, and those who seek to account for real politics. This is the conceptual register in which Bailey's understanding of a phenomenon typical of Indian villages helped me locate the continuity and prevalence, so to say, of such groups in village politics. So this is the first register. As I said that I'll speak on 3 registers, conceptually, theoretically, and methodologically. I move to the second register now. The second problematic in my research was also to situate the persistence of such conflict groups and their metamorphosis in a democratic setup marked by elections and networks between the village and the wider political and administrative context. I wanted to understand and map such networks between the village, the administrative level of the district, consisting of several villages, and the regional political networks that relied on the lower level factions at the village and the district level for recruiting followers. Village studies by social anthropologists have found that factions within a village present a picture of solidarity and rarely extend their support as a faction to district or regional level political groups. In a study of Orissa, Bailey had noted this tendency of villagers to stick together in their dealings with outsiders. I wanted to test whether these observations held good when mapping the networks of alliances and support that determine the context of factionalism in my study. Here, the most important methodological tool proposed by Bailey, the concept of networks and a processual approach to politics, became useful to understand how village factions at different points in the political history of Andhra Pradesh became significant as bases of political networks in different arenas, such as the village, the district, and the state level. The conceptualization of arenas in Bailey's conceptual toolkit was especially significant in order to explain the divergent ways in which the rules of political engagement operated at different levels of the political structure. Such rules, as Bailey had demonstrated, are normative and pragmatic in nature. A normative rule in the arena of the village might not be valid in another arena, say that of the courts. Just as a pragmatic rule in one arena can be turned into a normative rule in another arena over time. A processual analysis therefore helps us detect the shifts in the nature of rules, as these are far from immediate, and also helps us map the contexts in which the moral or normative element of politics is more pervasive than a transactional or pragmatic element. Thus, tracing the networks of political groupings called factions in different arenas in a processual manner was the second register in which my study of factional violence utilized Bailey's vocabulary in explaining the negotiations between structural frameworks and individual action. The third register in which I benefited from Bailey's study, the ethnographies of politics, is methodological. Methodologically, my study benefited most from what came to be understood as situational analysis in the Manchester School's ethnographic methods. Situational analysis had implications for the presentation of data, since it required that a series of connected situations be set out extensively with the same set of actors appearing from one situation to another. In my study, I used this method in order to locate the relationship between faction leaders and their networks at the village, the district, or at the state level. For example, usually a faction of a political party at the state level would, in most cases, have linkages with village level factions drawn from the faction leader's kin and caste members, or with political representatives owing allegiance to him at the district level. Situational analysis also helped in mapping how the relationship between leaders and followers was never dyadic and unidirectional, but involved networks of reciprocities, enabling us to analyze the normative orientations and transactional roles involved in such leader-follower relationship, and how such relationships transformed as political resources also changed with changes in the political and administrative context. I'll stop here. I don't know what is the time like. Have I taken 10 minutes or more, Victor? Like, is it all right if I...
Exactly 10.
All right. So I'll stop here with a note that when I did my fieldwork for my doctoral research in the year 2000 and 2001, I was only sparsely familiar with Bailey's theoretical and methodological works. My engagement with Bailey has been gradual, and my appreciation of the significance of his work has grown over the years. I deployed his insights over a period and came to understand the affinities in what I was studying with his pioneering work on the transitions and transformations in India's political system. So I'll stop here.
Very nice. Thank you very much. Felix?
All right, thank you. I'm coming in from a different angle yet again, and I'll start very autobiographically. So it was 19 and a half years ago that I flew to San Diego to meet F.G. Bailey. I was youngish and very impressionable. So in that sense, I was really fortunate that he was so down to earth and modest and not somebody who'd use his charm and his rhetorical qualities to overawe a young scholar. It was a few strange weeks after 9/11, and we actually ended up watching the beginning invasion of Afghanistan on his TV set up in the hills over San Diego. But this trip actually, when I went to see him and stay with him for a few days, for me, it was at the midpoint of my passage to Bailey, so to speak. In late 2000, my supervisor for my MA thesis at the University of Mainz, Professor Ivo Strecker, he had suggested, Felix, why don't you write your MA thesis on Bailey? And we in his working group, we had been reading Bailey because we were concerned with developing a rhetorical theory of culture. And Bailey seemed to be like a key thinker regarding especially political anthropology for developing a more complex understanding of how rhetoric shapes social life. So I began to read, and I read some more. And when I was done with the library in Mainz, I used these old paper-based interlibrary loan cards to get various essays scattered in obscure edited volumes from other libraries. And it was quite some effort at the time, if I recall. And my aim was to work out, basically starting from the beginning, how the toolkit, the concepts, the theory of F.G. Bailey had developed over the decades. So when I was around 25, I had basically read 90% of what he had ever published, and it didn't damage me, but it shaped me in a very, very sustainable and long-term manner. And to me, then it all made perfect sense. Reading from the beginning, how from the volumes on India to Stratagems and Spoils, and then into the 80s and 90s and 2000s even, it was, I could sort of follow with this development. I understood how he got from here to where, and how he picked up earlier thoughts and developed them further, and how he ever refined his approach to get closer to what interested him. And yeah, so when I went to San Diego, I had read all this. I had nearly finished my thesis already, but we still spent some very, very nice days up in the hills talking shop now and then. And yeah, then I flew back. We stayed in touch via email, and every couple of months dropped each other a message, and he told me of his and Mary's well-being, ever shifting, and took interest in sort of my career developments as they were, and even my family, and we exchanged pictures. It was all very, very cordial. But the main thing is, when I went to field work in Ethiopia, and you see my virtual background behind me, I felt prepared to immerse myself in a very much a face-to-face village society. And I was primed, I was sensitized to look for debate and compromise, for people weighing morality against expediency, for tactical uses of passion, for the complex play of tribe, caste, and nation, case being substituted with ethnicity here in my case. And this really, really, I saw my field basically through the vocabulary I had gleaned from Bailey's work. And it worked out for me really well. What I had learned from him seemed directly applicable to understand this, yeah, this social life world that I was in, where everybody knew everybody else, and there were all these multiplex relations, and I needed to know so much about everybody to understand how conflicts escalated, how they were mediated, and in that sense, the toolkit itself, it came alive for me in the field. So I'm probably brief here in this autobiographical part. We tried to invite him to Mainz to one of these rhetoric culture conferences in 2002 and 2005, but he didn't feel he was up to the trip anymore. But he still contributed a chapter to one of the edited volumes that came out in the book series. And in that sense, my link to Bailey's work is pretty much the opposite of Gavin's, because I'm with the latest developments which he took in The Saving Lie and the volumes just before then. This is where I am, with my interest in rhetoric, with my interest in these micro studies. I found this, yeah, and still do, in my new field in Ethiopia, in Myanmar. I still am interested in exactly these matters. And for me, I'm surprised really how formative this exposure and this engagement with Bailey has been. I dearly enjoyed our correspondence when he inserted some anecdotes from the past, which for me was like ancient history, how he snubbed Dumont, and then he informed me of the correspondence he had with Liz Colson in Zambia, what was happening with her and all that. He was so happy to share, and I was so happy to listen. And well, Victor, I always called him Freddie because that's how we started off. And that's where I'll stop for now.
Again, wonderful. Thank you, Felix. Just to remind you, we're going to start again with Gavin. You can hear me, can't you? Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Felix?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So we're going to start with Gavin, and really we haven't got any questions yet, but we're looking forward to a Q&A session. We're in time, so if you do have questions, Facebook or chat, and just put them there, and I'll take note of them. So Gavin, you're on.
Well, I mean, Felix has now got me thinking about Freddie stories and so on. And let me tell you,
of course,
an ironic story about Freddie, you know, because here was the guy who was developing a whole technique for understanding university politics and the micro-politics of strategies and so on and so forth, especially in the university. And, you know, one of the jokes some of us always used to have is that, you know, people who go into psychology are completely unable to control their own sort of mentalities, and people who go into sociology don't understand society. And so here was Freddie being a specialist on micropolitics, and he came into a seminar to break the news to his graduate students that he'd been offered the job at San Diego, and he thought that we were all going to be absolutely shocked. And everybody leant over and said, "Freddie, we've known this for at least 3 weeks, if not a month." So I thought that was a wonderful example of, you know, practice and teaching. So let me just begin. My comments are about a little bit off kilter from what Victor wants, but let me just begin this way with that old joke that you probably know of the traveler who asks a local person how to get to his destination. And the local person scratches his head, thinks for a while, and says, "Well, I wouldn't have started from here in the first place." And I sort of feel that way when I talk about, you know, my feelings with Freddie. So it's been with Freddie and me. Freddie not only felt the academic project should be devoted to explanation, to the exclusion of political purpose, he wrote extensively against strong political convictions. I come from the opposite direction. I think if your inquiry serves no political purpose, it's just art for art's sake. I even think that research design should begin with an explicit political purpose, which in Schutz's terms defines one's horizon of what is relevant. Even so, I've learned an immense amount from my time with Bailey. I'd say two things distinguish his work from mine. I don't think he was very interested in what Eric Wolf would call structural power. To give a rather facile but very current example, not just the racism of actual actors, but institutional racism and how institutional racism works in contemporary North America or Britain or wherever. I think the notion of structural power was something that you can work with Freddie on that, but I'm not sure Freddie himself was especially interested in that. And that links, I think, to the second of the points that I would make, which is that like Freddie throughout his career, I'm interested in what I call leverage. I think Freddie was fascinated by leverage. In Spanish, actually, it's rather an odd word to use because palanca is also a kind of word for corruption. So Freddie would find that amusing, like the way he always enjoyed that switch between gifts and poison, right? That was Freddie's little joke about gifts and poison. So he's always been interested in leverage. And for me, leverage is absolutely fundamental. It's the one thing that I'm really interested in. It's what it takes to get things done. For me, it's mostly about collectivities of people and how they get things done. And that makes me especially interested in class, but not in the Weberian sense that is mostly used, but in the Marxian sense of the conflicts that arise to the surface from what are essentially structural contradictions that can't be resolved. And so they arise as interpersonal conflicts or intercollective conflicts. That's my particular way of looking at it. So, so those would be my two kind of edges in a way to, you know, what would Freddie's work look like if it was a little bit more, he's always been fascinated by power. He was always fascinated by power. But how about if he looked at it in a much more, a much larger kind of notion of structures of power, what collectivities of people have power and so on and so forth. And in fact, I mean, since I have the moment, let me just say that this was actually a real problem in writing my thesis. Because actually Freddie left, of course, before I went to the field. And I had a really extraordinary sort of nomadic existence after that, because I asked Freddie who I should transfer to in the department. And he said, absolutely nobody. Nobody's going to get on with you, Gavin. You're going to have to go somewhere else. So I went to Manchester and I met Peter Worsley, and he said, don't come here, for God's sake, it's a terrible department. and he subsequently left and went into sociology. So then I went to Edmund Leach, and Leach was fascinated by my field. I was terrified of Leach. I mean, I'd heard all horrible stories about Leach as a person, but he was incredibly nice to me, and I wanted to study primitive rebels. And Leach wasn't especially interested in rebellion. So he said, no, I don't think I can help you. And he put me on to John Barnes, who became my supervisor for 6 months, until I was told at Cambridge that I had to stay for 2 years before I could get to the field for my residence requirement. So I then went back to Sussex with my tail between my legs and knowing absolutely nobody who was going to work with me. So I happened to be interested in jazz, and as a result, I had met Eric Hobsbawm, who was the jazz critic for Melody Maker magazine. So I asked Hobsbawm if he would be my informal supervisor, and he said, yes, go back to Sussex and pick the laziest person on the faculty to be your supervisor, which is what I did. And the only comment I ever got from my supervisor at Sussex was when he saw the final draft of my thesis, he said, the whole thing is going to have to be redone. It is absolutely unacceptable. And when I asked him what the problem was, he said that the requirement was 1.5 inches margin and I'd got 1 1/4 inches. So that was as far as he got on my thesis. So getting back to that, I would say then that the first thing that I would say about Freddie is that that was one of the things that I felt I wanted to push after I came back from the field. And oh, I was just going to say that the funny thing about it was that because of my training with Freddie, I had lots and lots of stuff, very much the way Gitika has described her own work. I had lots of material about situational analysis, about particular ways in which leaders in the community had manipulated things and so on and so forth. But the previous chapters of my thesis had all been about breaking down the class structure of the peasantry in the rural Andes. So my last chapter of Stratagems and Spoils was kind of thoroughly sort of informed by the fact that these people all came from different kinds of class backgrounds and so on and so forth. So I found that quite a difficult thing to negotiate. So yeah, I mean, I think that's what I would say. If I was going to say, you know, what is his legacy now, I think I have to turn to the audience for this. I mean, I'm sure you have much better ideas about this than I do. I would just say two things, which I think are very current in anthropology now. One of them is, what is the appropriate scale for anthropological inquiry? I mean, is it necessarily always a micro kind of enterprise, or can it skip scales, and how do we skip scales? And I think that's something that would be interesting to talk about in terms of Freddie. And I'm actually embarrassed because I wrote this before, of course, having heard Felix say that he's particularly interested in the rhetorical construction of culture and so on. What I was going to say was that people who came from the Manchester School were absolutely uninterested in culture. It wasn't even a word that came into their vocabulary. And so one of the fascinating things about Bailey is how that shift occurred. From his days at the Manchester School, where it was all about transactionalism, agency, strategizing individuals, and so on and so forth, and gradually moved to something that could be much more understood in the context of American cultural anthropology. I always used to say to my students, you know, in some ways, the way to distinguish the kind of European anthropology, well, Western European anthropology I was trained in, the sort of British school, was that it was participant observation. It was definitely observation, whereas American cultural anthropology is all about listening. It's about sitting with somebody and they tell you how things work, and it's about understanding culture, not understanding how people interact. So the interesting thing about Freddie is that he did bring those two things together. And I think the question we now have to ask is, where does that stand now in current anthropology? That particular dialectic, which is the word that I think Gitika used when she was referring to this kind of thing. So I mean, that's why I brought up Schutz in the first place, because I don't think Freddie would ever have been interested in Schutz per se, but it was fascinating to come to Freddie's work having been influenced by social phenomenology, because his work really does work very, very well from that kind of perspective. And so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. I never thought of the connection between Schutz and Bailey before, but very interesting. Gitika?
Yeah. So the second question that was posed, actually, the appraisal and contemporary relevance and any methodological and theoretical limitations. So first of all, what I would like to do is to locate Bailey in his intellectual context, so that we, am I audible? Have I unmuted? Yeah. Yeah, so locating Bailey in his intellectual context, that's the first thing that I would do, so that we also understand that Bailey's limitations are not his limitations. It's probably the limitations of a particular paradigm that he belonged to at a particular time in the history of ideas. So that's the first thing that I want to say. So if we locate Bailey in his intellectual context, he was clearly a part of the thriving moment of modernization theory, with its implicit and not so implicit value biases and teleological schema in his early ethnographies. His interest in the interaction of traditional and modern political institutions is part of the scholarly agenda pursued in several studies undertaken in newly independent nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America in the 1950s and 1960s, assess the suitability and sustainability of democratic and parliamentary institutions in these societies by social scientists of various hues, like political scientists, economists, social anthropologists, sociologists, and so on. Though these studies share several features that are justly critiqued for their ethnocentrism and imperialist politics, Bailey strikes a distinct note that makes aspects of his work more enduring. For instance, he clearly states and adheres to the research objective that it is not his concern to adjudge the merits and failings of parliamentary democracy in these societies, but to comprehend how ordinary people acting within the framework of representative institutions were adjusting themselves vis-a-vis indigenous customs, levels of cultural attainment, and membership of such traditional groups as villages or castes, or in the light of traditional roles like landlord, tenant, prince, priest, and so forth. So as Professor Smith also pointed out, that Professor Bailey was most interested in explaining a situation and not judging it. I mean, in that sense, I mean, he didn't take sides. So very importantly, therefore, Bailey's paradigm is thus most useful in unraveling routine politics and not such grand political events such as wars or revolutions, as he himself avers in his 1969 classic, Stratagems and Spoils. He writes, and I quote, "Coups and revolutions are certainly more violent and more dramatic than the Westminster routine, but surely it is impossible to assert in any absolute sense that they are more important. Importance is relative to the values of whoever is making the judgment. It is not an attribute of events themselves," close quotes. By this statement, Bailey also clearly sets out his preferred understanding of political anthropology, to understand politics as quotidian and mundane, and systematically resist the grand statist visions of politics, an understanding that has a wider reference than merely to the activities of those who are ordinarily considered politicians. Perhaps his most innovative contribution is to understand political action as embedded within both local levels of power and larger encapsulating state structures, rather than the so-called real seat of power and sovereignty, the state. These insights were later popularized in the French philosopher, sociologist Pierre Bourdieu's practice theory, which similarly disavowed an excessive focus on the state for explaining political practices. Some of the concerns that Bailey attended to in his ethnographies of Orissa, such as the interface of patronage and clientelism with class, organizational and interpersonal strategies that inform everyday political interactions in varied settings, coalescence of various types of groupings in the arena of representative politics. And these concerns are finding renewed resonance in contemporary studies of Indian politics. Clearly, therefore, Bailey's analytical model is best suited to understand politics as everyday, where political power is given a theoretical and empirical legitimacy, sans the idea of resistance. This has been a significant lacuna in his paradigm, which decries passionate politics or ideological and revolutionary politics as beyond the purview of the quintessentially political. Bailey, in his later writings, has addressed this criticism, continuing to be faithful to a pragmatic view of politics. In contrasting pragmatic politics with true belief or ideology, Bailey settles the conundrum by arguing that every true belief also has a pragmatic element. And I quote, "When people compromise over matters of principle, they have re-examined a true belief, an ideology, and factored it into a set of preferences. Once that is done, the guiding light is no longer only the true belief." And within parentheses, he mentions these, what are these true beliefs? Socialism, Indian independence, Oriya nationalism, non-violence, social and economic justice, and so forth. But also pragmatism itself, the principle that requires one to monitor an ideal, to see how far or in what alternative forms it can be realized, and to find out what will be the costs of doing so, close quotes. So these, I think, are finding, as I said, renewed resonance, not only in understanding Indian politics and what is actually going on. I mean, several states in Indian politics are currently having their state elections, and I find that this understanding of how different arenas come together, or within a particular arena, different coalescence of groups, for instance. So those kinds of registers, those kinds of ways of explaining what is actually going on in Indian society, I think those are important, enduring lessons that we can take from his oeuvre. Now, what I would like to end with, again, is to foreground, very importantly, that Bailey was there was a certain fidelity in his entire theoretical apparatus to pragmatism, to reason. And I'm currently reading Bailey's last book, God Botherers and Other True Believers, which also is a mature statement of his fidelity to pragmatism and reason. So I'm still reading it and trying to figure out what he was trying to say. So when he talks about Gandhi, when he talks about the ideology of nonviolence, he clearly shows that even when Gandhi believed and professed nonviolence, there were elements of pragmatism where he reworked the idea of nonviolence itself. And this is exactly what Professor Bailey was trying to understand, that when do we bring in a certain pragmatic reconsideration of an ideology itself, and for what purposes? That's the most important thing, I think. And therefore, we find that when we're trying to talk about Bailey, and when we look at the last book, this is again a mature statement where he comes back to India. He comes back to his understanding of Gandhi, how people of India understand Gandhi and his ideology of nonviolence today, and also very importantly ties it up with the rise of the fundamentalist right and also Hitler's regime, by talking about what is understood as true belief or ideology. And therefore, I stop here by again saying that reading Bailey is rewarding because it never fails to offer something thoughtfully novel and opens a window to see what is hidden in plain sight. I'll stop here. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Gitika. Okay, we have our last speaker, Felix.
Yes, thank you. You all know this feeling when you've prepared your notes, then other people say interesting things all the time and you scribble all over your notes, and then there's stuff happening in the chat and you want to respond to it. And okay, I'm a mess now, but I'll try to make the best of it. What is F.G. Bailey's legacy? That was a tough question. And I think it's two questions. And again, I'm speaking here sort of from the perspective of a political anthropologist. And the two questions are, what is his legacy and what could it have been, or what should it have been, what might it have been if things had gone differently? So in which way does his work inform contemporary debates, and in which ways could it inform contemporary debates? And I'll try to address both and maybe even reconcile them in the end, but this is a tough dialectic here. Good. I was already wondering about this when I was working on my chapter for the Festschrift. I ended up addressing some of who I call the malcontents, who took exceptions to various aspects of his oeuvre. But I don't think that the criticism by Seidel Silverman or by Georg Pfeffer was what actually brought us to the point that Bailey's work has comparatively little impact in anthropology today. You find very few references, very, very few clear, explicit invocations, very, very few people sampling his methods. It broke off at some point, and I used an imperfect tool to try to find out when this happened. Google has this tool called the Ngram viewer. It's discontinued now, but it still exists, which allows you to search for a string, so a search string, and it gives you incidence and frequency of the search string in publications over time. So I chose Stratagems and Spoils as the 1969 publication that made F.G. Bailey a brand name in political anthropology beyond the South Asia crew. And I searched, and this is what I found. Can you see this? Oh, my virtual background is killing it. Hold on. Let's see if that works better.
Yes.
In 1969, it goes up and it stays up here until 73.4. Then it dips, goes up a little more in the late 70s, and then by 1983, it's nearly at zero. and it dips, sort of crawls along the x-axis a little more, and only rising a little higher up in recent years, maybe due to everybody's efforts here, I don't know. And this is not a very sophisticated tool, but it gives you some sort of initial insight of how much a work, a central work in somebody's oeuvre is being read and cited and referenced. And well, we see it, by the 80s, this wasn't what people were looking at in terms of political anthropology anymore. What happened? I mean, Gavin already gave several of the keywords. Interests shifted. Instead of having a political anthropology that was very much interaction and micropolitics focused, we soon had so many anthropologies off. And most of these anthropologies off, this and that and this, they were very much interested in these things which Freddie wasn't interested in, like structural power. You called it out. And of course, these important concerns like the state, for example, which for him would only have been, in his later work especially, it would have been an example which might crop up during his field work, but which wouldn't have been the topic of which he would choose for a research question. So there is this shift. There's his shift, and there's a shift of a field. And why was his kind of political anthropology focusing on these micro situations? Why was it abandoned? I mean, this is one idea, is sort of that people were moving away, trying to get at the bigger issues, trying to become more political, as Gavin wanted them to be also, and which Freddie strongly refused. Oh, at this point, if anybody knows more about the relation of Jim Scott and Freddie, I'd love to hear it later in the discussion. I know Freddie gave him some advice on field work way back when, but if anybody knows more about what went back and forth between them, keyword resistance as well, I'd love to hear about this. This is, to me, is an unresolved open question. So many factors could be identified which sort of constrain his legacy, but for the sake of discussion, also I'll boil it down to one term, because rather than seeing these rules and pragmatic and normative rules as the key terms of Freddie's oeuvre, for me, it's the word claim. The claim is, after a certain time, certainly in the 1970s and onwards, is the central part of what makes his toolkit tick. He looks at what from debate and compromise. Now it's my turn to read a bit. How can we discover what was that individual's real motivation? I don't think we can. The best we can do is discover the motivations which are explicitly current and explicitly acceptable at various levels in that particular culture, and how, when they conflict, they are measured against one another. This is, in a nutshell, how he analyzes struggles, conflicts. He looks at claims, he looks how people issue claims and counterclaims, and if at the end it turns out that one claim prevailed over the others, he can work backwards from that and see how that came to pass. This is an approach which was also already mentioned here. In a way, it's very close to practice theory. It's also very close to ethnomethodology. And I once asked Freddie, have you read ethnomethodology? And he said, oh, Sikurel, maybe, but it's more like the collegial osmosis that Kevin mentioned in the comments with Freddie, with his relative reluctance to cite other, mostly his arguments from against case material or the classics or literature even. It never knew what he actually had read. So he is getting towards these people who will look at how culture, if you will, but social reality is constituted in practice. And the claim is essential for that. And the claim, of course, means we give up. We give up wanting to get inside people's heads. We just surrender. We just say, okay, there, we know people have thoughts. We know people have genuine affects, but we simply admit that these are not accessible to us. We restrain ourselves and only look at what's out there. What are the things the actors care about? This also picks up what Gitika mentioned above. The relevance lies not in anything outside the situation. The relevance of a conflict lies precisely in what the protagonists and the antagonists make it to be about. So many of these big topics, which all the anthropologies were concerned, which they were trying to get a grip on, which they were trying to establish as subfields, for him, they were participants' concerns. His interest in the state would have been mostly how people in interaction claimed that the state is and how the state should be. Both this normative and pragmatic arguments, but both in the end are claims, and they're issued against counterclaims. And in the end, as humans are, one sticks and the other doesn't. An important point here, of course, is the audience and the various third figures which he introduces in his work. And also, he's not interested in what the audience really thinks. He just is interested in what the audience does. What does it endorse? Which sort of side of the fence do people come down on and support somebody's claim how a situation should be defined and interpreted and how it should define what follows from it. So this claim to me, again, I go back to my Ethiopian fieldwork, this was valuable. I was in the field, I was listening to statements, to arguments, to political debates, and I understood imperfectly, especially in the beginning, and I asked my friends, so what is he saying? And okay, and then they already said, okay, he's saying that this and this, but then they give you this look, like, does he really mean it? And this is the point. The actors themselves don't know whether the other one means it truly. Even the most intimately effective, genuine feelings, they must be communicated effectively to actually matter in a situation. And in the field, on the Omo River in southern Ethiopia, I had this, it really worked, it clicked for me that the actors themselves in a situation, they can operate at the same level as the analyst. And the other way around, the analyst can, in this very modest, in a way, in this very modest toolkit of Bailey's, there are these tools to get at the actors' concerns and see how they trade off this against that. What they value, what they cherish, we can only assume, but we can see what they do. And this, for me, again, it was an extremely helpful approach in fieldwork, to look at sides in a struggle as people issuing claims without being totally agnostic whether anyone really means anything they say, and then realizing that all the audiences were in the same boat as I. They also didn't know whether he really meant it or didn't mean it, but they were basing their reactions on how skillfully something was done. And in the end, they decided to, even if they weren't fully convinced, they decided to let themselves be persuaded and say, okay, let's go along with that. This and the claim, I think if you look closely at work and publications of Freddie from the 1970s onwards, you'll find that you can basically see this idea of the claim as the atom of social interaction running through and being ever further refined and developed in these various publications. And this, on the one hand, this is, I think, what could be the legacy, to have a toolkit which is very modest, which does not assume to get into people's heads, which does not try to do anything for which the data is flimsy, which keeps us far away from confusion such as ontologies, etc. But at the same time, of course, this is also what limits the appeal of his work, because people are sometimes not satisfied with these modest, humble situational analyses, which emulate how actors see situations, which allow us to sort of step into the actor's shoes and see, okay, how they came to this decision and how they justify the decision to themselves. But we know how anthropology is. People have grander desires. And if you want to make larger statements about the world, if you want to be more sweeping, if you want to launch a new school, a new field, you will not find the tools for it in the toolkit of Freddie Bailey. And this is how I think these two things, what legacy is and what legacy could be, are to be reconciled here. I've taken his very basic statement that we cannot look inside people's head. I've taken it to heart and made it sort of the core of my entire work in my studies on ethnicity in the Omo Valley and my work on critical heritage studies in Myanmar. And so far it's borne out, and I hope that my analyses are robust, but never overreach for this. Thank you.
Well said. I must say, and I'm sure lots of you agree with me, that these were three of the most interesting panelists or speakers I've heard in a long, long time. So, you know, I want to applaud you for what you've done, all three of you. It's remarkable, really. We probably have some questions, but I've looked through the list, and there's one question. The person wants to know who, I can't find it right now, but I remember it. Who was that lazy supervisor? Give us names.
Yeah, well, Robert could answer that question. It was Peter Lloyd. Peter Lloyd was the laziest supervisor you could possibly imagine. I'm sorry to say that about Peter, and I have no hesitation in saying it whatsoever, and I know that most of my peers would have said the same thing. In fact, yeah, well, I won't go on. But anyway, he was perfect for me.
And I just open it up a bit. Are there people who have questions or other ideas about that engram of Felix's? I have my thoughts on it, but I hope somebody in the audience might. Why don't people read Bailey nowadays? That's kind of what you said, right, Felix?
May I comment for a second?
Yes,
always, Herb.
Yeah, specifically following up on Felix's point about the legacy. It's not just that Freddie Bailey's legacy has been forgotten in this way, I think. Let me just briefly suggest an overview. Sort of political anthropology, insofar as it was a
sorry,
not my phone. Okay, political anthropology, if it began, let's say, with African political systems and the heavy emphasis on politics as the way systems are governed and the whole Radcliffe Brownian view, was almost immediately overtaken with by the Leach and Firth and Barth perspective that led to a more interactional and an understanding of the interplay of actors. And by the time of the late 60s, we had Bailey, and then there was Barth and the Schwartz, Turner, and Tooten series, and the whole the impact of Manchester and the non-group approach, the actor-oriented approach, and so on. And this was, I think it was about 1978 that Joan Vincent wrote that article in Annual Review called Political Anthropology, Manipulative Strategies, I think. And she describes all this very nicely. And then as she comes to the end, she is more or less prophesying that we're not going to hear that much about this anymore, because world systems and the Andre Gunther Frank and Marxism is taking over, largely, I think, as a result of the whole impact and of that period that Gavin was talking about, that the whole reaction to earlier anthropology. And in a sense, a movement, this actor-oriented and sort of practice theory avant la lettre, was sideswiped. It was knocked out of the way by this whole rebellion and the whole then leading to post-colonialism and so on. So I think that's why we don't hear much, not only of Bailey, but of Barnes or Boissevin or Barth or all of the other Bs, like in music, like Bach, Brahms, and Beethoven. We have Barth, Bailey, and etc. So that's the point that I would make.
Hi, this is Sarah Dickey. I recently, well, because of the Festschrift, I have been not only rereading almost all of Freddie's work, which was had quite an impact on me again, but looking for recent citations of his work, mostly using Google Scholar, which makes it easy to look for citations. And the one set of material that I can say does still appear in at least the literature on social structure and social process in India is about caste. And mostly still often drawing from his 1965 article, which I think was something like Caste and Social Stratification. I don't have it completely right, but sorry, 64 article, but also more recent work like The Witch Hunt and other times when he's talking about the ways that people, particularly how caste members that he identifies are juggling for position and the extent to which they will challenge social mores and to which they will not. A lot of it being about pragmatics. Mostly that's in the context of looking at the history of approaches to caste, and contrasting Freddie with Louis Dumont. Gitika may have more to say about that, but that was one realm of his work that I did find still cited fairly regularly.
Yeah, so if I can respond to Professor Dickey, I think the article that you are referring to is Parapolitical Systems. So that is still something that we read and we teach to our students as well. So it's called Parapolitical Systems. It was anthologized in the edited volume by Michael Schwartz called Local Level Politics. So I think probably that is what you are referring to. It's interesting that you're talking about Dumont and Bailey, because Dumont and Pocock, when they started the journal, the Contributions to Indian Sociology, I think Bailey was a MA student, if I'm not wrong, and he was invited to contribute to the discussion because, in a way, I think what they wanted to achieve was a certain kind of I would say that they wanted to achieve a fruitful disagreement. I mean, there could be fruitful agreements, but what they wanted to achieve in the pages of contributions, and this is also something that Professor Smith had talked about earlier, and I would characterize it as a fruitful disagreement. So while on the one hand, Dumont was talking about caste as homo hierarchicus, which is what Indian society is seen as, Bailey, on the other hand, was pointing out very interestingly, and this is something that Professor Smith would probably, I'm sure you would know about this. Bailey was in fact looking at in what ways economics plays a very important role in transforming caste as well. So his first book, Caste and the Economic Frontier, which is about Orissa, which is about two different kinds of villages. One is a highland village and one is a plains village. And he's trying to understand what happens when trade frontiers in terms of economic, in terms of the economic aspects, how they differentially affect the two villages. So I think what he was trying to do, and as I said, that, when we think about Bailey being invited to contribute to that discussion, which is the debate on forest sociology of India. So whether we have a sociology of India or whether we have a sociology for Indians, I mean, that was, I think, the very, very important kind of a contestation between Professor Bailey and the original founders of the journal, Dumont and Pocock. And I think, as I said, that's something which also led to this kind of a fruitful disagreement. And it was later on carried on by many people. And I mean, Professor Dickey would know about all of these people. Joan Mencher, for instance, who worked also in Tamil Nadu, and her very famous work on the caste system upside down. So how does the caste system look like from the point of view of the lower castes? So overturning actually the whole Dumontian idea of hierarchy, and how does hierarchy look like when it is looked at from the point of view of the lower castes, the Dalits. So those kinds of works, then I think, I mean, even though probably they don't mention explicitly Bailey, but I think they took off from those kinds of concerns that Bailey introduced in the discourse. So yeah, so that's what I wanted to say. Yeah.
Gitika, I would add that the article I just looked up and remembered the title of the article that I was referring to, which is Closed Social Stratification in India.
Yeah, I understand.
Came out in '63, yeah, and I need to look at the one you're talking about as well.
Yeah.
Because this one was actually about the reference of the word caste. So he was looking at jati, at caste, and the different kinds of meanings it has on the ground. And that was, again, very different from Dumont. It was about what it means for the people who live it, not what it means for those of us looking from above. Yeah. So I think that's a great contrast.
As also caste as an ideological apparatus, because Dumont's whole thing was about caste as an ideological apparatus. And Bailey was trying to actually put flesh and blood in that whole idea, how people actually look at where they belong and the meanings that they give to that identity. So I think that was a very important point that you make.
Can I just make a comment on something that Felix said? And it's a long time since I've read any Schutz, but what Schutz would say to your last description of your project was that there's a distinction between behavior, practice, and conduct. For Schutz, behavior is what Skinner did. Practice is what Freddie is interested in. And conduct takes into account the fact that people may not act at all. Conduct includes the other two, if you see what I mean. Conduct requires that you do know, you have made some account of what the mental constructs are in a person's mind before they enter into a scene, a particular scene or whatever. That's one point. The other point is that I think we've missed out here, which would be very interesting for you people who know more about Freddie's later work than I do, is how did Freddie feel about history and historical anthropology? I mean, it strikes me that when you talk about claims, and I do think, Felix, that's a very neat way of talking about Freddie stuff. I like that very much. But it does strike me that the kind of claims that Donald Trump made during the 4 years of his presidency, and the kind of claims that, let's say, I don't know, somebody else, or let's say Modi in India, the kind of claims that are rendered as legitimate claims to be made are a question of much larger structures than simply the local. And they do need to be given a kind of historical, dare I say, even material kind of background. We have to know what were the material conditions that made the kind of Trump phenomenon occur. It's not just a question of shifts in ideology, it's really a historical question, it seems to me. And I don't by any means mean to call upon such things as world systems theory. I think that I wouldn't go in that direction. I am kind of amused though by Herbert's comments, because actually at that time, Peter Worsley wrote a piece called The End of Anthropology. And I notice now that in the current iteration of that isn't it burn anthropology? I think that's what we're talking about now.
Burn it down.
So yeah, I do think that one of the areas that we can usefully move in is history. And of course, just using the word history is not very helpful. Edward Thompson's history is not the same as, you know, Charles Tilley's history or something, but there's no question that there's some relationship between the kind of way somebody like E.P. Thompson thought about historical unfolding and culture that is very important for anthropologists. But you have to, I think, understand that although anthropologists grabbed onto Thompson, his use of culture was almost the exact reverse of what had been the conventional use of culture in anthropology. I mean, it's the reverse of what I would call a Geertzian view of culture. That is to say, it's very much something that is emergent as a pattern in a whole social formation. And then particular collectivities of people can grasp onto that pattern. They make it, but they also take advantage of it. And I think that that's a kind of anthropology that I'm more interested in, I think.
As to history, this is a simple answer and probably too simple, but I think Freddie would consider history a genre of rhetoric. What I want to talk about is something more personal, and that refers to Gavin's remark about Freddie thinking of anthropology as something that people who feel marginal go to. And I want to connect that to Freddie's decision to come to San Diego, which of course I don't know in any detail. Myra knows more about that. It certainly would be a radical shift. It was a radical shift for Mary, I think, to come and for Myra. One answer is, who would not want to live in San Diego? Such a paradisical place. Right, yes, okay. That's another form of rhetoric, by the way. But I think part of it had to do with Freddie's feelings about class in Britain. I think some of his insight into caste, to be phenomenological, arose from his sharp and very personal insights and experience of class. And I think class was, given his own biography, class was an aspect of Britain or of England, since the Scots have a different view of class than the English anyway. Freddie's view of it made him feel marginal, even in his military service, where he was commissioned but seconded to a very fancy regiment, where his fellow officers treated him properly, but in a way he knew what his own background was. So he comes to the US, to San Diego, in which he could be an outsider also. And I want to connect that briefly to my remark about being surrounded by brilliant cultural theorists at UCSD. Freddie, in many ways, although his relationship with his colleagues, and I say this as a graduate student and then his colleague for a year, was always proper, although he always had interesting things to say about his colleagues. It was always proper and respectful. And I know that he read their works, and some of them, Ted in particular, read his, but he was very much the social anthropologist in that department. He remained marginal. He was surrounded by brilliant cultural theorists and a variety of them. Bob Levy was not the same as Ted Schwartz, and Mel Spiro was deeply Freudian. And while reading their work and being surrounded by this sea of interesting, if soon to be outdated, cultural theory, he absorbed a lot, but he absorbed it as a social anthropologist, and he absorbed it as someone who, in a sense, took that notion of rhetoric and what people say and communication and language, that part of culture, very, very seriously, and learned from it and contributed to it. And if you read The Saving Lie in particular, you can see that. But I came to think of Freddie as someone who remained marginal and flourished at UCSD. If you look at that remarkable string of books after his retirement, I can barely read a professional journal article now after my retirement and remain engaged. But if you look at his remarkable string of books after it, I think a lot of them reflect the kind of intellectual milieu of UCSD, of the anthropology department then, without becoming part of it in some sense. I think of Freddie as someone who appreciated the beauty of the Mass and went to the Mass on some Sundays in the month, but would never take communion. And I think his own view of marginality and class and caste in his earlier work, and what attracted him about American culture, not uncritically, but what attracted him and what made him comfortable at UCSD in a way that I think he would never have been entirely comfortable had he become the Regius professor or whatever at Oxford. It was very much part of his biography. But I may be spinning air here. I don't know what Myra thinks or wants to say, but Freddie always remained, to me, an appreciator of the Mass, but never a communionard.
Hi, Kevin. I was going to say, I wasn't planning to say anything, so this will all sound rubbish. I think Dad liked to observe people. He didn't like to be part of something, although he always enjoyed, if you said, we're going to a party, he'd say, no, I'm not. But if you made him go, he would go and he would observe and he would come back and comment on it all. Yeah, I think you're right. He was didn't want to partake of the Mass. He'd watch it. And the reason he told me he went to California was for the money, the weather, and the reduced workload. So, I mean, I probably shouldn't take that too seriously, but that's all I've got to say. Okay.
Yeah, I once asked Robert Payne why. I said, I'm really surprised Freddie's gone to the States. He was so committed to the Sussex department, and it was his baby, and he really was somebody who enjoyed, doing this and building it up. And it very much has to do with what is it Professor Girke was saying. It had to do with a class thing for Freddie. I mean, setting up Sussex was a class statement for Freddie, I think. And that's one of the reasons we used first names too, I think, and nobody called anybody a professor. So when I said to Robert, I'm really surprised that Freddie's gone to California. And Robert said, what do you mean? You don't know Freddie. He went for the money, he went for the sun, and he went because he didn't have to do as much work. So you got it right, Mara. That was absolutely what a lot of the people of his own age group felt about Freddie. But that's what they loved about Freddie, right? I mean, there's no question he was a little bit of an opportunist in a certain kind of way. He admired opportunists. That was that was his take on things to a great extent. But the thing that makes him distinct from most opportunists is that he was an amazingly loyal person. He really supported people all the time. And as I said at the beginning of my talk, I've never seen anybody who you could throw Freddie 10 pages of scribbled notes saying, you know, I'm not sure what I'm thinking here, Freddie, but it's something I want to say. And he would go through them in detail and he'd give them back and he would convince you that it was your idea in the first place. That's a brilliant way of being able to teach graduate students. I mean, anybody who can emulate that, it's almost impossible. And I never found it afterwards with Freddie. And in my case, it was especially important because I wasn't an anthropologist. My story is kind of a funny story of the 60s and 70s because I was an investment banker on Wall Street. And then when Mario Savio stood up in Berkeley back in the day, I thought, shit, what am I doing here? I should be doing something a lot more kind of down on the ground. And I started reading, you know, Saul Alinsky and Ravalli for Radicals and stuff like that. And this was the time when anthropologists were organizing teach-ins about the Vietnam War. So for me, anthropology was the only radical discipline you could really go into if you wanted to work with people on the ground. So, and that was why I was fascinated by Freddie and his Stratagems and Spoils. It just seemed to me to cut into the sort of glorification of that stuff and show, you know, what happens inside those kind of situations.
I am really struck by the comment that Freddie left in part because there would be less work at UCSD, because while he was producing such an incredible chain of monographs, he had by far the heaviest load of dissertation students of anybody, by far, when I was there. And I have to say, I fled the department per se after my first 2 years there. But when I left at that point, which would have been 1984, I believe he had 3 times as many graduate students as anyone else in the department. He had a very heavy load. And so he was working, and it was just as you said, Gavin, I would be writing from Seattle. I would send him a 60-page chapter. Within 24 hours, he would return it to me covered with comments. He was an exceptional teacher and model and interlocutor in the real sense of the term. So yeah, thank you.
But you know, it's a different kind of work. I agree with you. I mean, obviously, Professor Bailey was a very hard worker, but not in terms of all this kind of committee stuff, right? That you would, so it's a different, what you guys have just taught me really illuminates the path that you take. There's different kinds of work that is more, you know, satisfying. So in that sense, the workload is lighter because it's work you enjoy more.
That's what we all want to do though, isn't it? I mean, I made it my business. Maybe I learned from Freddie, I don't realize this, but I made my business to be the biggest nuisance in our department. And it worked very, very well for me. I was never even made a graduate coordinator, let alone chair of the department. People knew that I was a pain in the neck. So, you know, and I don't want to sound as though I'm boasting here, but I also had by far the most graduate students in our department when I was in the department, because that's what I enjoyed doing. Just as you say, Alyssa, it's you know, you do what if you can. That's the way it works. So
I think you're all right. Dad enjoyed working with students. That's what he liked to do. He liked to teach. And when he did have to sit on committees, which he did go through a period of chairing the department and going to committee meetings, he studied the people there and came up with a book about it. So he made use of it, I suppose. Yeah.
Right.
Do we know how the people felt who he wrote the book about?
He went for a year's sabbatical as soon as it was published.
I can recall a story that he shared about one of his colleagues who became increasingly concerned about whether or not he was going to appear in the book, or it was a later version. He was sure he was in earlier ones, and then you know, came in and at one point said, you know, and Freddie had reassured him, no, that's absolutely not you. And his friend or his colleague insisted that must be me. And I think it was a draft, and Freddie told the story of ripping out the page and saying, there you go, I'll just remove it and you'll be gone. And he later shared the story, and I think it was with several of us graduate students, but that he actually was there in a much later part of the book, but he never really recognized himself. And it was one of his psychological anthropology colleagues, but he took a little bit of glee in that. Nobody was really represented in whole. It was always a melding of people and situations. And of course, the earliest book on academic leadership was a blending of his work in England and then in the military, and of course, at UCSD. So things were kind of, you know, hidden a little bit, but I think that people were a little bit nervous about that. And I think that he felt it did get him off of committees and back to the real work of being an anthropologist and a teacher, which, I mean, he loved both of those. And as somebody who is a brilliant scholar and researcher, he actually did embrace his teaching and loved it. And I don't think so many of them were so proud of that part of their work. Maybe another legacy that he leaves. He definitely did things on his own terms.
Well, let me just say that I'm greatly enjoying this.
In the issue of asking a question, can I ask you people, because you knew Freddie later, and I think it's been a puzzle to me, maybe it is to Gitika as well. And I think, you know, it's been a sort of unanswered question, maybe just a rhetorical question. Why did Freddie never go back to India? I mean, it seemed to me that I know what happened at Sussex, and I don't know if you American or part of the audience you'll probably get this, but you know, what really happened was there was absolutely no research money for fieldwork. And Freddie picked up on that very quickly, and that's why he did that pushed that European program at Sussex, because he knew that people could do field work, you know, relatively close to home without spending a lot of money on doing their field work. And in my case, I worked as a merchant seaman to get to my field site because there was no other way I could get there. And then I got stuck there because I couldn't get a job getting back. But yeah, so I think that in that moment, when he moved to Sussex, he realized that his students probably couldn't afford to do field work in India. But was it, you know, because Freddie seemed to me to be very much in love with his Indian field work, and he was, you know, an incredible field worker. Was there any other, did he ever talk about that with people at San Diego?
I think part of it was the political situation, that the part of India he was in was quite a dangerous place to be in the 60s. And I suppose he had children at home and a wife and wasn't willing to take the risk.
Right.
I think much later on, it may have been a little bit different, and it may have been that he was just so much more passionate about the ideas and the writing, and that at that point, the field work itself didn't seem as important, carrying on more field work. He had a wealth of material and had gone in that direction and really contemplating, you know, more of the ideas, and even revisiting some of his earlier work and rethinking that, as we saw in the Witch Hunt and those books that came at that point in time. But you know, it may have been a shift in thinking and just simply a shift in his life stage at that time. You know, one thing when he had small children, and then later on, different kinds of commitments, I think, took priority.
I think it can also be said of most anthropologists. They do their field work as graduate students. Then if they're lucky enough to get a job, very few, at least I seldom went back to Sri Lanka. Maybe I went back once, not because I didn't want to, it's just because there's no time to go back. So I don't know if it was some kind of conscious decision on his part. Also, I kind of disagree with the money issue that that was brought up, because I think in the 1970s, going to India was probably cheaper than going to Spain or somewhere else for field work for a graduate student. I would imagine when I went to Sri Lanka, the costs, except for the airplane fare, were ridiculously cheap, and that was 1979. So I doubt if it was money.
But were the students at Sussex people who also had jobs and children and so forth? I'm just reflecting on the San Diego State situation. A lot of our students can't go because they're not free, 22-year-olds. They have other lives.
Yeah, that's a good question, Alyssa. No, I think the answer is that this was before that began to step in with graduate students. I think pretty much all the people I knew were 100% just doing their graduate work. I don't think anybody had a job on the side particularly, but that's a very good point. I mean, that's become a huge issue now, I think. People really do have to, it's tough. You've got other jobs and stuff like that,
So perhaps it comes back to what Mary Kay said to a degree. I mean, if there was already this basket of data, the field work that was done, that was still being worked with, there wouldn't be a need to go back. And then too, sometimes we like to preserve the past in our minds as it remains in our minds versus going and then everything gets scrambled. And then where are we?
Yeah.
If I can just piggyback on that a little bit as well, I think that as he learned from his colleagues and even from students and continued to think and develop his own ways of thinking, I think he sort of re-engaged with that earlier work in his mind and thought, aha, I'm going to go back and look at what I was thinking then. And I think especially some of that postmodern and post-structural work, thinking, what was I doing at that time in India, and what was I thinking, and how would I look at that now? And I think there is that reflection, especially in the three books that are about that time period, sort of looking back and also reevaluating how he approached that work. So it was really a whole different mindset of, kind of applied to those field notes, which were gorgeous in and of themselves.
A comment related to that is Freddie's incredible generosity. He didn't want to go back to the field himself, it seemed, but he was incredibly generous when Edward Simpson and Tina Otten from SOAS came by, and he just opened up his entire archives of genealogies and handwritten notes and photographs, and he was delighted to have someone take on the work and continue the comparative study. So that to me was a real contrast to other faculty I've worked with at UCSD who seemed very protective of their work and not wanting anyone else to comment on the quote, the data. So I appreciated that about him and his generosity to students that he was supervising, but also to the anthropological world at large, as Felix experienced and as Tina and Ed experienced a little bit later on.
To get back, I just went to a point that was made a long time ago about the engram and why Bailey is no longer read as much. I would guess it has nothing to do with him and everything to do both with the zeitgeist of the times and also with the state of anthropology. So I'm a cognitive anthropologist, and I ask my students, and oftentimes, to give me what's called a free list. Just list all the musical bands you know. And what's interesting about it, every year that I do this, they'll give 100 names. Each student averages about 50, 60, 80 band names. But the Beatles typically come out on top, but they're only named, if I have a class of 30, by maybe 4 students. And so all the students know the Beatles, but it's surprising, only 4. In my generation, if I asked people to list all the bands they know, we would have clear, the Beatles, the Stones, and whoever else. But after, the other interesting thing is, after about the 6th person, And then I asked the class for a seventh person, do you know this person? And then maybe two people know that person. So that there's so much fragmentation in the kind of music that students listen to, that there's not much consensus on even the top 10 musical groups that they listen to. And if they do mention the top 10, it's usually old classics. Like if you ask people to list all the poets you know. Nobody knows contemporary poets except a few poets, but they all know, William Blake and Shelley and so forth. So I kind of think if you ask people to list all the anthropologists, list the 20 most famous anthropologists alive today, or the 20 most famous anthropologists, they either go back to the 1920s and 30s, but there's no consensus there. So I think the field is fragmented. And we're fragmented on all sorts of things. And I think that's part of the reason why Bailey isn't read, because nobody really reads. There's no small group of contemporary anthropologists that all anthropologists read.
And people read fewer books.
And people read, yes, they read fewer books. And they cite more people without ever having read them. Frederick Barth complained, I'm getting cited all the time, but always incorrectly. I'm not sure I got that right. And it might be an incorrect cite. Okay, so we seem to have reached the natural end here. Are there any pressing questions or things people want to bring up? I think it's been wonderful. We've been together for 2 hours and perfect amount of time. I'll miss all of you for some time, and I learned a lot from listening to you. So maybe we can do something for Bailey again to bring us together. Who knows? Thank you all for showing up, and I'm going to turn this off. Goodbye.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you,
very much.
everybody.